Hello, my name is Bill Truels. I am a general surgeon in Oklahoma City, semi-retired, and I wanted to talk about the Mafia murder of Marilyn Monroe. I believe this information is probably generally known among a small group of people, and maybe in 100 years the government and others will come forward and say, okay, we're going to tell you what happened. But until that happens, I'm going to give my best explanation. There are two anecdotes that I have from people that I've known that have shed light on some of this situation. The first is a FBI retired agent named Robert Fitzpatrick. He worked with Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy in Washington, D.C., and he had an interesting story to tell. John Kennedy would on occasion sneak out of the White House without the Secret Service knowing it, and he would sneak out in the backseat of a senator's car or some other such way to get out and visit one of his girlfriend's houses. And what would happen is that J. Edgar Hoover went ahead and bugged all the girlfriend's houses that JFK would frequent. And when they would hear noise at one of the houses, the FBI would call the Secret Service and say, we got to tell you where John Kennedy is. He over at such and such address. And the Secret Service would rush over with the nuclear football, which had all the launch codes, for the ICBMs in case of a sneak attack from Russia in those days. And it was sort of embarrassing for the Secret Service, but what this really tells you is that John Kennedy's girlfriend's houses, most likely including Marilyn Monroe, were in fact bugged by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI because they had to keep tabs of where John Kennedy was so they could get the nuclear football to him. The second personal anecdote that I have is related to my Greek family, extended Greek family in Chicago. The story goes that a 18-year-old girl named Eugenia Pappas was an attractive Greek girl who was a hairstylist and a distant relative in the Greek family. And she befriended a man named Frank Schweiss, S-C-H-W-E-I-H-S. And Frank Schweiss, it turns out, was in the Mafia. But Eugenia dated him and relates to the story of traveling from Milwaukee Airport, a group of hitmen that flew to Los Angeles on the morning of August the 4th, the day that Marilyn Monroe died. The hitmen went to a party, and then they left the party, and then they came back after a while, and then the next day they flew back to Chicago. Eugenia relates later, after she broke up with Frank Schweiss, that this was a hit on Marilyn Monroe on orders from Sam Giancana. Now, subsequently, Eugenia Pappas was killed and was found in the Chicago River several months later. And many of the people that had been involved with the Marilyn Monroe murder were sworn to secrecy, including a Jean Carmen, who was one of Marilyn's girlfriends. She later wrote a book called My Wild Wild Life, and Jean Carmen went into hiding for 16 years until Sam Giancana died, was killed, and then came out of hiding and tells her story of the Mafia involvement in the murder of Marilyn Monroe. A couple of other anecdotes that were in the newspaper and well known. Recently, Marilyn Monroe's house in Brentwood was sold, and the couple that bought it did a renovation. They knocked out some of the walls, and they found within the walls hundreds of feet of wire that didn't connect to any electric outlets or anything else, and that most likely were involved with wiretapping. And prior to Marilyn moving into her house in Brentwood, which was only 10 minutes away from Peter Lawford's beach house, where the Kennedys would frequent, Marilyn had the house renovated, and it's very possible at that time that the wires were inserted in the walls and the house was bugged. Two of the men that were involved in wiretapping for J. Edgar Hoover and also sometimes for Jimmy Hoffa were Fred Otash and Bernard Spindle. So it's fairly common knowledge that Marilyn's house was bugged. Marilyn even knew that her house was bugged and would sometimes go down the street and use a payphone And also they said that Peter Lawford at his beach house would at times go down to a payphone because he was suspicious that his house was bugged as well. One other piece of information that I think is interesting is in a book by Sam and Chuck Giancana involving the Marilyn Monroe murder. They mentioned that a suppository was concocted by a university chemist that had Nembutal and chlorohydrate, and that this suppository was a part of the CIA Mafia plan to kill Fidel Castro, and that the Mafia had this suppository available and had used it on some of their own victims and verified that indeed it did work. In fact, they found that with Marilyn Monroe, she had 15 times the fatal level of chlorohydrate and Nembutal in her bloodstream at the time she died. And this had, in my opinion, been most likely from a suppository. You couldn't get that many pills down somebody's stomach and get that high of a drug level. Also, Jean Carmen relates that Marilyn had called her the night that she died and asked for sleeping pills because she was out of sleeping pills. Jean Carmen declined and said, I don't have any either. But it's interesting that here Marilyn was out of sleeping pills, and yet she's been accused of taking an overdose of sleeping pills less than an hour after she had called Jean Carmen. So it's unlikely that Marilyn died from ingestion of Nembutal chlorohydrate pills. Much more likely that this explanation from the Giancanas that there was a suppository that the Mafia had been given to be used on Fidel Castro, and that the Mafia got creative and decided they'd use it on Marilyn Monroe. Let's talk a little bit about motive. Why would Sam Giancana of the Chicago Mafia want to suicide Marilyn Monroe? What was the motive going on here? And this has to do with Robert Kennedy and his war on crime. Sam Giancana was #1 on Robert Kennedy's hit list with regards to the war on crime. Literally, Giancana was under lockstep surveillance, which meant that wherever he went, there was an FBI agent following him. He was an enemy, really, of Robert Kennedy for a long time. I can remember back in the 50s, there was an Allgauer restaurant in Chicago. I was about 12 years old, and it burned to the ground sometime around midnight from some professional arsonists. And at that time, there was an extortion going on of Chicago restaurants that for protection money. If they didn't pay the protection money, they would suffer. And Robert Kennedy was one of the investigators of these restaurant fires, and was in Chicago and was on the legal team investigating these Chicago mobsters. So Robert Kennedy's dislike of Giancana goes back many years. Robert Kennedy wasn't opposed to the casinos and other aspects of the Mafia control, but just these more illegal operations going on with regard to protection money and also union racketeering and so on that Robert Kennedy objected to. Now, it's known that Marilyn was dating John Kennedy. They had known each other for a number of years and had a relationship going on. Subsequently, John broke up with Marilyn, and Robert Kennedy began dating her. Marilyn was really more intelligent than in the movies. You know, she plays kind of the dumb blonde, but in reality, she was a reasonably intelligent woman. She actually wrote some poetry in her journal, and did very much enjoy talking to the politicians really on their level. Robert Kennedy also was quite intelligent, if he was a lawyer for one thing, but also he liked to quote Greek poetry and other very esoteric things, I guess you could say, that he was academically inclined. The two of them did get along, and they subsequently did break up. Now, Giancana didn't take too much to Marilyn dating Robert Kennedy. This was his arch enemy. And this created some friction because Marilyn knew Giancana, and she also, of course, knew the Kennedys. So when Marilyn broke up with Bobby Kennedy, she had to try to somehow make amends with Giancana. It was then, I think, that Giancana devised a plan. How could he embarrass Robert Kennedy and force him to resign as Attorney General. Remember, Robert Kennedy had been voted Family Man of the Year. And I believe Giancana then came up with the idea, well, what if Marilyn were to commit suicide right after Bobby Kennedy left? Wouldn't that be a scandal that would end his career as Attorney General? So I think what Giancana then did is pressure Marilyn to say, I want Bobby Kennedy to go back and apologize to you at your Brentwood home. And perhaps Marilyn just innocently agreed to this, or perhaps she was pressured into agreeing to this, but she then called her friend Jean Carmen and said, I want Bobby Kennedy to come to my house and apologize for breaking up with me. There's also rumors that Marilyn had become pregnant and had an abortion, and that this further complicated the situation. But be that as it may, Jean Carmen says, well, we've called Bobby Kennedy's house. He won't answer the phone. Marilyn tried calling Bobby Kennedy's house. He wouldn't answer the phone. So Jean Carmen then tells Peter Lawford, look, as she describes in her book, Jean Carmen says, tell Robert Kennedy that Marilyn has a tape of them making love, and that if he doesn't come and apologize to Marilyn at her home in Brentwood, that Marilyn would release this tape. Now, in fact, Marilyn did not have such a tape. She knew her house was bugged, but she didn't have any of the tape or any other information. But whether innocently or not, Marilyn agrees to tell Bobby Kennedy, get word to Bobby Kennedy through Peter Lawford, that Bobby Kennedy need to come to her house and apologize, or they would release this tape. And that then sets the trap up that Giancana had set up to suicide Marilyn right after Bobby Kennedy left. So on August the 4th, 1962, Bobby Kennedy, Peter Lawford arrive at Marilyn's house at somewhere around 4 in the afternoon. And there may be some apologies that occurred, it's hard to say, but Bobby Kennedy said, all right, I want that tape. Well, Marilyn has to say, well, Bobby, in fact, there was no tape. That was I just said that because I wanted you to come and apologize. At that point, Bobby became furious. He really believed that Marilyn had a tape, and he starts rummaging through the house looking for it. What does he find? He finds in the closet that there's some wires that could be used with a microphone, and he becomes furious. And a very big shouting match then occurs where Marilyn was apologizing, saying, I'm sorry, I don't have a tape. I just told you that story to get you here to apologize. Bobby Kennedy is furious. There's one report that actually Marilyn falls down or is hit and falls down and has a black and blue mark on her left hip, which is found at autopsy. At any rate, Marilyn becomes hysterical, and finally Bobby Kennedy leaves, but he has Marilyn, Dr. Greason, come and give Marilyn a sedative shot to try to calm her down, and Bobby Kennedy then leaves. Now, several hours later, we know that the hitmen then come in. They're monitoring what's going on, most likely with the wiretapping that's going on at Marilyn's house. They probably are in a truck somewhere and are hearing all this. So what happens now is that the hitmen move in. Perhaps they open the door with Johnny Rosselli, who knows Marilyn quite well. They break into the house, most likely through the front door. Marilyn is given this fatal suppository, and they wait until it takes effect. And this chloral hydrate is kind of like a Mickey Finn. Once you're out with it, it's a knockout drug. You're out, and eventually quit breathing and die within a fairly short period of time. Now, because of the fight that had ensued earlier and Marilyn's hysterical state at that time, Dr. Greason has Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, stay at the house that night. She doesn't normally stay at the house, but Eunice Murray stays at the house, and she's going to stay there all night. This is kind of a little mix-up in the original plan. The original plan would be that Marilyn would be discovered dead that following morning. The police would be called, and there'd be an investigation, and Robert Kennedy's name would get dragged into it, and so on and so forth. But with Eunice Murray there, as Jean Carmen relates the story, the hitmen also abused Eunice Murray that night. In other words, Marilyn wasn't the only victim that night. That Eunice Murray was intimidated, and she was told, you will tell the police that Bobby Kennedy had been here earlier, and you will not talk about our presence here tonight. If you do, we'll come back and finish you off and finish off your family. And that's my opinion, that there are probably death threats against Eunice Murray if she didn't call the police. So now Eunice Murray had a dilemma after the hitman left. Should she go ahead and call the police and wait until that next morning? Or should she call Peter Lawford and let him know what just transpired? Well, what Eunice Murray decided to do was, in my opinion, to call Peter Lawford. I don't believe it was Marilyn Monroe that called Peter Lawford and said, you're a swell guy and say goodbye to everybody, her so-called say goodbye speech. I believe it was Eunice Murray that called Peter Lawford, because when you're hit with knockout medicine, the so-called Mickey Finn type medicine, you're out. You don't wake up and get on the phone and call somebody. I believe it was Eunice Murray that called Peter Lawford and said, look, some hitmen have come in here. They've killed Marilyn, and they've sedated her, and she's hardly breathing. Get over here fast. And I believe then that Peter Lawford and Robert Kennedy came back. And the story is that Marilyn was taken to the hospital, pronounced dead, and then the next cover-up ensues. Marilyn is brought back to her Brentwood home and placed back in bed. And this time she's placed face down. Instead of where she died, she was face up. And the phone is put in her hand to make it look like she called Peter Lawford, to set up the idea that it was Marilyn that called Peter Lawford and not Eunice Murray, in an attempt to spare the Mafia's revenge against Eunice Murray. So now Peter Lawford and Robert Kennedy had a dilemma. Do we just go ahead and announce that the Mafia came and killed Marilyn Monroe? Any kind of investigation would probably draw Robert Kennedy into the whole thing, because he had been there just a little bit earlier, and people would say it was that Robert Kennedy was responsible for all this and would end his career as Attorney General. So in effect, what happened is they decided, well, Marilyn's dead. There's nothing's going to bring her back. Can we save Robert Kennedy's reputation? And so in effect, what there was is a second, if you will, a second conspiracy. The first conspiracy was to say the Mafia killed Marilyn and make it look like a suicide. That was the first cover-up. Now the second cover-up occurs with Peter Lawford and Bobby Kennedy, and they say there's nothing we can do to bring Marilyn back. Let's go ahead with the idea that Marilyn committed suicide. Let's call J. Edgar Hoover and have him step in and compromise this investigation. And we're not going to bring Marilyn Monroe back to life, but let's simply deny that Robert Kennedy had been there that night and go along with the idea that Marilyn Monroe committed suicide because she had a history of a drug abuse. She had a history of previous attempts on her life. She had a history of mental illness, having been for a short period of time hospitalized. And let's just go that route and spare Robert Kennedy. And I want to say at this point that Robert Kennedy, in my mind, was one of our greatest attorney generals. He fought the war on crime. I mean, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Robert Kennedy actually was acting president for several days. John Kennedy said, take over a couple of days. I'm not doing well. I'm having problems with my back. He was on sedation. And Robert Kennedy was our acting president and kept a cool head. So I really am a strong supporter of Robert Kennedy, despite his private life. You know, he's not the first politician to have problems with the private life, and we all know all the politicians that have had those situations. But I think it was worthwhile to spare Robert Kennedy's reputation and cover up the Marilyn Monroe murder and go ahead and call it a suicide, sell it to the American people as a suicide, and Robert Kennedy would go on to be a fantastic attorney general. Now, the only problem with the whole scenario is that if in fact there is life after death and there are spirits, and Marilyn Monroe's spirit is around somewhere, you'd have to think that if Marilyn Monroe had one wish, it would be that she be exonerated from this stigma of having committed suicide. She did not commit suicide, and I believe that would be one thing that her legacy, her spirit would say, can we someday tell the American people that Marilyn Monroe did not commit suicide? So the cover-up that Peter Lawford and Robert Kennedy then employs to say, well, Eunice Murray went to bed. She woke up at 3 in the morning. She saw a light on under Marilyn's door. The door was locked, couldn't get in. She called Dr. Greenson, and he came and knocked on the door, and Marilyn didn't respond. And then he went outside, broke a window to the bedroom, and got in that way, and pronounced Marilyn dead at that time. So this really kind of lets Eunice Murray off the hook. She wasn't the one that called Peter Lawford. She called, in fact, Dr. Greenson when she saw Marilyn's light on under the door, and it was Dr. Greenson then that called the police. And this kind of lets Eunice Murray off the hook in terms of not being the one responsible for calling Peter Lawford and Bobby Kennedy and finding time to contact J. Edgar Hoover, have J. Edgar Hoover move in and confiscate the investigation and the files. Now, what advantage did J. Edgar Hoover have to protect Robert Kennedy? And the two of them, we know, didn't get along. But this really would guarantee J. Edgar Hoover that he would have his job as FBI director secure, because he had done this for the Kennedys. So I think it was one of those, you do this for me and I'll protect your job. And in fact, the very next day, Robert Kennedy announced that J. Edgar Hoover would be keeping his position as FBI director, and that he had done a great job in his fight against communism. So it was a deal that was made to protect Robert Kennedy's reputation. And I think from that standpoint, I think it was a good thing, because Robert Kennedy did a fantastic job as Attorney General during the Cuban Missile Crisis, keeping a cool head and actually acting as an acting president during that time. So let's construct a timeline on the Mafia murder of Marilyn Monroe. I accept what Jean Carmen has to say, Marilyn's girlfriend, who was in hiding for over 10 years until Giancana's murder, at which time Fred Otash said it was okay, and Johnny Rosselli said it was okay for her to come out. And let's talk about also, I accept what Sam and Chuck Giancana had to say about Sam Giancana and his role in the Mafia murder of Marilyn Monroe. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, August the 4th, Saturday, 1962. Bobby Kennedy and Peter Lawford visit Marilyn Monroe at her house. Bobby Kennedy was pressured to see Marilyn on the basis of the fact that Marilyn claimed she had a tape of their lovemaking. And Marilyn did this in order to try to get Bobby to apologize to her personally. Whether Marilyn was forced to pressure Bobby into doing this by Giancana, trying to get back into Giancana's graces, or whether Marilyn thought this up all by herself is hard to say. But they do arrive, Bobby Kennedy and Peter Lawford. They visit Marilyn at her house, have a initially pleasant talk, and then Bobby says, okay, let me have that tape now that you claim to have about us making love. Well, Marilyn then says, I have to tell you, Bobby, and she's telling the truth, there is no such tape. I just said that to try to get you to come and apologize. Bobby becomes very angry. He doesn't believe Marilyn. He starts rummaging through the house, tearing things up. He goes into the closet and finds some wires and a microphone. And now he's really mad, and he comes back to Marilyn. Marilyn either falls down or gets knocked down. She has a bruise on her left hip at autopsy. She begins hysterically crying. Bobby says, where's the tape? And she keeps saying there is no tape. And finally Peter Lawford kind of restrains Bobby and says, okay, let's just call it quits here. Marilyn is hysterically sobbing. They call Dr. Greenson, and he gives Marilyn a sedative shot, and then Bobby and Peter Lawford leave. They do ask that Eunice Murray stay with Marilyn for the night, because Marilyn is upset and crying, and just to calm her down and be with her as a companion through the night. Marilyn kind of settles down. She's on the phone several times. She talks to Joe DiMaggio, thinks about marriage to Joe DiMaggio. She has bought a wedding gown. She's won $1 million contract with her new movie endorsement, and things are looking pretty good. Well, then in come the hitmen. Sam Giancana's boys come in, and they are in the guest room. Marilyn is in the guest room, and she's then given this suppository that I referred to earlier that was from the CIA that to be used against Fidel Castro. It was concocted by a university chemist. It had very high levels of chloral hydrate and Nembutal in it. According to Giancana, they then taped Marilyn's buttocks shut to make sure that the suppository would get absorbed and not ejected out. And Marilyn finally, after probably not more than 10 minutes, passes out. Now this is kind of like a Mickey Finn. When you have chloral hydrate, you don't just wake up and get on the phone when something like that happens. Marilyn's out and out cold and unconscious when the hitmen leave. There's no opportunity for her to pick up the phone and call Peter Lawford and say goodbye to everybody and you're a swell guy. That never happened. Marilyn was out of it and unconscious. Eunice Murray then has been intimidated by these hitmen and said, you will call the police and you will tell them that Marilyn committed suicide, or we'll come back and kill you and your family. You know, that's the typical type threat that's used. And also Gene Carmen says that Eunice Murray had been physically intimidated by these hitmen as well. So the hitmen leave, and Marilyn is unconscious in the guest house bedroom. And what does Eunice Murray then decide to do? She has to make a decision. She decides to call Peter Lawford. And she says, Marilyn's in bad shape. She's unconscious. Get over here fast. And they tell her, call an ambulance and try to resuscitate her. So Peter Lawford and Bobby Kennedy, they're 10 minutes away at the Peter Lawford's beach house. They drive over, and then the ambulance comes. They resuscitate or try to resuscitate Marilyn, giving her CPR. And then Dr. Greenson is there, and he pulls out a syringe and injects her with this brown liquid he says is epinephrine. Well, the ambulance driver says, well, wait a second, I've never seen epinephrine look like that. What happened there was that epinephrine, if it's too old, over a year old or 2 years old, will turn sort of a reddish brown. It still will work, not as well, but it's not toxic. And the ambulance driver, not realizing this, thinks that Dr. Greenson gave some toxic chemical to Marilyn, but actually it was an old vial of epinephrine. Didn't work anyway. Probably wouldn't have worked no matter what the age of the vial was, because Marilyn had a fatal dose of chloral hydrate and Nembutal. So they get in the ambulance, they take her to the hospital, and she's pronounced dead for the first time. Bobby Kennedy apparently, even according to some, prayed for Marilyn in the ambulance. But Marilyn has passed away, and now something interesting happens. Her body now goes back to Brentwood. And it doesn't go back to the guest house bedroom, it goes back to the bedroom that's in her house. And the reason for this is that they want to create another story later in that evening that'll be more compatible with Marilyn being in the main house bedroom, her regular bedroom. So Bobby Kennedy then leaves. He leaves at 2 o'clock in the morning in a helicopter from Peter Lawford's beach house and goes back to San Francisco. Eunice Murray and others clean up the house. They take the sheets off the bed in the guest house. They put them in the washing machine. It's very possible that when the hitmen removed the tape, that some chloral hydrate, some Nembutal, perhaps even some stool or blood came out. So Eunice Murray washes the sheets, and when the police arrive later, the sheets are in the washing machine. They take the Nembutal bottle that's empty. They move it from the guest house into the Marilyn's bedroom in the main house, but they forget about the water bottle. There's no glass that goes with it. So the police, when they arrive, they look at that and they say, well, where's the glass that she used to swallow all those pills? And about an hour later, the police notice that a glass appears on Marilyn's room. So the police are suspicious that things weren't done right. But prior to the police coming, they take Marilyn's body and they put her face down, holding the phone, so that it looks like she had called Peter Lawford. Now the livor mortis, L-I-V-O-R, mortis, has already settled into the back of Marilyn. And that happens because it goes to the dependent position. Marilyn died laying down. And it happens over a period of 2 or 3 hours. But then Peter Lawford and them take Marilyn's body and put it face down so that she could be holding the phone. And the police notice this. They say, wait a second, she's been turned over after she died because the livor mortis was on the wrong side. So at any rate, the story as it now occurs, and as Eunice Murray now creates it, is that she wakes up at 3 in the morning and she notices that Marilyn's light is on, looking under the door that the light is on, and also that the phone cord is going into the bedroom. And normally before Marilyn goes to sleep, she takes the phone, brings it back out of the bedroom, puts it in the phone room, and then turns off her light and goes to sleep. So Eunice Murray said that she got worried about Marilyn at that time, and she knocks on the door. There's no answer. And so at 3 in the morning, Eunice Murray calls Dr. Greenson, who then comes over. He knocks on the door as the story goes. Marilyn doesn't wake up. And so he goes out, breaks the window to the bedroom, supposedly climbs in this bedroom window, and then announces that Marilyn is dead for the second time. So she's been pronounced dead twice now. And Eunice Murray then says, okay, well, let's call the police. So the police arrive. It's now 4 in the morning, and they are looking. They see that Marilyn Monroe has been turned over. She's now on her stomach, and the livor mortis is on the back. They notice that there's a Nebutol empty bottle, but they notice there's no glass there when they first arrive, and they're wondering why Eunice Murray is washing the sheets at 4 in the morning. So they're suspicious about everything that went on. But the purpose of this second cover-up, the first cover-up was the Mafia killing Marilyn Monroe, making it look like a suicide. The second cover-up is Peter Lawford and company also making it look like a suicide to protect Bobby Kennedy, because any decent investigation into Marilyn's death would have necessarily dragged Bobby Kennedy into the picture. It would have been an embarrassing scandal, perhaps the end of his career as Attorney General, and damaging his war on crime. So the idea was to get Bobby Kennedy out of there and then have time to call J. Edgar Hoover to come in and cover things up, perhaps even the LA police to cover things up. The phone records disappear, and the autopsy slides disappear, and other cover-ups go on to protect Bobby Kennedy. So the police are basically at a loss to explain some of these inconsistencies. But the idea was to give time for, number one, Bobby Kennedy to leave. He leaves at 2 o'clock in the morning on helicopter back to San Francisco, and give time for J. Edgar Hoover and the LA, certain elements within the LA police to compromise the records and compromise the investigation. The whole idea being to protect Robert Kennedy, and as I mentioned earlier in this video, it was a valuable thing that he was a very valuable person during the Cuban Missile Crisis when he was acting president, and his war on crime continued as well, and many dozens of criminals were put in jail as a result of the war on crime. One interesting footnote also is that at the end of Giancana's life, he is killed, and according to Gene Carman, and also there's a man named James Files, it's Johnny Rosselli who does this. Johnny Rosselli gains access to Giancana's house in Chicago, as he would because Giancana trusted him. But Giancana was to testify before the Senate with regards to assassinations. And perhaps the government didn't want that to happen. Perhaps the Mafia didn't want it to happen. Also, Jimmy Hoffa was scheduled to testify, and he dies shortly before he can testify to the government, which sort of points to the government being involved in those deaths. At any rate, Rosselli gets in, and he shoots Giancana, kills Giancana, and as Giancana lays dying, according to the account given by Gene Carman, as told from Fred Otash, is Rosselli is yelling at him, "This is what you get for killing Marilyn Monroe, putting a contract out on Marilyn Monroe."
And so as Gene and Connor lay dying, the last words he hears are Rosselli yelling at him about his decision to murder Marilyn Monroe in an attempt to embarrass Robert Kennedy and force him to resign as Attorney General and put a dent in his war on crime.
So let's go over the different scenarios for Marilyn Monroe's demise. The first one is that Marilyn committed suicide. That's the one that's the most popular in the press today. There's problems with that. First of all, the level of Nembutal and chlorohydrate in Marilyn Monroe's bloodstream was much higher than you could get with pills. They said would have had to take 75 pills to get such high levels, and yet there were no remnants of pills in Marilyn's stomach and no discoloration of the stomach. In addition, Jean Carmen relates that she got a phone call from Marilyn that night requesting sleeping pills because Marilyn was out of sleeping pills. So how could Marilyn have taken an overdose of sleeping pills if she didn't have any? Another stickler is that the doctors, Dr. Engelberg and Dr. Greenson, had never prescribed chlorohydrate to Marilyn Monroe. So how did she get all this chlorohydrate in these little bottles with the doctor's name on it? Can we pursue the doctor's names? Not really, because the bottles have disappeared. In addition, Marilyn was not depressed. She had just won $1 million contract from her studio, and she was very upbeat. She was reinstated on the set of Something's Got to Give. She talked on the phone about getting a wedding dress and marrying Joe DiMaggio. So Marilyn was quite upbeat that night and not depressed. So I find the scenario of suicide to be very unlikely in light of these situations. Another scenario for Marilyn's demise would be seen in Jean Carmen's book. Jean said that, and others have said that Marilyn became pregnant and that this was a cause for concern with the Kennedys. And other articles discuss that perhaps even members of the Rat Pack were threatening Marilyn because she did not want to have an abortion. Marilyn was 36 years old, and this was her last chance, she thought, to have a baby, and considerable pressure was placed on her to go ahead and have this abortion. Well, this wouldn't be a reason for her demise, because 2 weeks before her murder, she in fact did have the abortion, according to these same sources. So that would not be a motive, even if it were true that Marilyn were pregnant. That it's also been related that if she had the abortion, so that would not be a reason for Marilyn to be murdered. A third explanation for Marilyn's murder would be that Dr. Greenson injected Marilyn, according to the ambulance people, with a thick brown liquid into the heart. Marilyn was resuscitated at 10:30 Saturday night, August the 4th, and the ambulance driver related that Dr. Greenson, who was there, who assisted with the resuscitation of Marilyn, injected a brown liquid intracardiac, which he then said caused Marilyn's demise. But what happened here, in my opinion, was that the doctor was injecting an old vial of epinephrine. When epinephrine gets old, it turns brown and looks terrible because of what's called melanin pigment. This does not harm you, but it decreases the effectiveness of the epinephrine. And for a psychiatrist to be carrying around a bottle of epinephrine for emergencies, he probably never used it in 10 years, so who knows how old it was. But this was not a toxic substance. It was a weakened bottle of epinephrine, and even a fresh bottle of epinephrine probably wouldn't have mattered. So the matter of Dr. Greenson injecting a brown liquid as a cause of Marilyn's demise, in my opinion, is not a valid one. A fourth explanation for the demise of Marilyn Monroe would be that it was Robert Kennedy who hired the Mafia to kill Marilyn. Now the problem with this is that Robert Kennedy was not exactly on speaking terms with Giancana or the Mafia to any significant degree, because Robert Kennedy was busy trying to put all the Mafia members in jail. So it's unlikely that they would do a favor for Robert Kennedy. And in addition, the Kennedys never tried to kill any of their romantic disasters, if you want to call it that. This would have been something that had never been done before. The Kennedys just didn't do that. And in addition, Robert Kennedy had been there that night at 10:30. He was originally visited Marilyn around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But when Eunice Murray called Peter Lawford and said Marilyn's in a bad way, these guys came and did her in, they came over and tried to resuscitate Marilyn. Dr. Greenson, Robert Kennedy was there, and Peter Lawford, and they rode in the ambulance to the hospital. So it seems unlikely that if Robert Kennedy was trying to contract the Mafia to kill Marilyn Monroe, that he'd come back that evening and try to help resuscitate her. So I find Robert Kennedy an unlikely cause for Marilyn's death, or did not contract with the Mafia to kill Marilyn. I think that's an unlikely explanation. A fifth explanation for Marilyn's demise would be that the Mafia, acting alone, killed Marilyn Monroe. After all, Giancana was #1 on Robert Kennedy's War on Crime hit list, so the Mafia certainly had motivation. But there's a problem with the Mafia acting alone, and that is, we talked earlier about the fact that Marilyn's house was wiretapped, and that FBI agents would listen in a truck outside as the events in her house occurred, and some of these were tape recorded. So for the Mafia to act alone, knowing that the Marilyn house was bugged, and what's to prevent the FBI boys from jumping out of their truck and trying to rescue Marilyn? So if the Mafia was going to do in Marilyn Monroe, they would have to get some sort of approval or clearance from the FBI to stand off. So in my opinion, the Mafia did not act alone in killing Marilyn Monroe. A sixth cause of Marilyn's demise would be that the FBI and the CIA were very concerned that Marilyn had become a national security threat, and that they hired the Mafia to kill Marilyn Monroe because of national security. Now, in the case of J. Edgar Hoover, he was very leery of Marilyn Monroe because she had communist friends, or communist-leaning friends. Arthur Miller, her ex-husband, was known to be communist-leaning or leftist-leaning. And of course, J. Edgar was very paranoid, if you will, about the communist threat at that time. And he viewed Marilyn Monroe as a threat because of her communist friends. With regards to the CIA being concerned, there were recordings that Bobby Kennedy and perhaps John Kennedy had talked to Marilyn about the CIA Mafia hit team that had been formed to try to kill Fidel Castro. And this was done by William Harvey in the CIA, who contacted Bob Mayhew, and Bob Mayhew acted as a go-between, and he contacted Johnny Rosselli, who they considered to be a patriot, and they organized the CIA Mafia hit team. So Marilyn knew this, and there was concern that if Marilyn had a press conference and she was angry at the Kennedys, that one of the secrets that she would let out would be of the CIA Mafia hit team. Another issue that Marilyn talked about was unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. Our government has shot them down in the past, and they've been recorded on video by our government. Astronauts have talked about seeing them, but the official version is that they don't exist. That's fed to the American people. So this was another issue that Marilyn Monroe had heard of and heard the Kennedys talk about, that the CIA wouldn't be too interested in the public being informed of. So the idea here would be that both the FBI and the CIA had security concerns about Marilyn Monroe. Now, there were certain spies like Inga Arvad and Ellen Romech that John Kennedy had hung out with, and that had to be deported. You couldn't very well deport Marilyn Monroe. She was a citizen. So this would be another motive to have her suicided. Now, the only problem with the idea of the FBI and CIA wanting to do away with Marilyn because she was a national security threat is that Bobby Kennedy had just left the house earlier that afternoon at about 4 p.m. So why would the CIA and FBI have Marilyn suicided only hours after Robert Kennedy left? That could create a scandal. It could ruin Bobby Kennedy's career. So I don't think the motive for the CIA and FBI to kill Marilyn and use the Mafia would be national security. The seventh reason for the demise of Marilyn Monroe, and I believe the most likely one, is that the CIA and the FBI and the Mafia all wanted to see Bobby Kennedy's reign as Attorney General end. And by suiciding Marilyn right after Bobby Kennedy had been there, you have a making of a big scandal that would force Robert Kennedy to resign, as he had previously been Family Man of the Year. So what was the CIA's angle? Well, they were very unhappy with the Bay of Pigs and blamed the Kennedys for this. Robert Kennedy said that he thought the CIA was worse than the Mafia. He was very opposed to what the CIA was doing. William Harvey's wife was interviewed a number of years ago. She's 90 years old now, but still mentally sharp. And they asked her about William Harvey, and they both Mr. and Mrs. Harvey were high-ranking CIA spies. And she said that her husband and she both actually despised Robert Kennedy, used the word, hated Robert Kennedy, but they loved Johnny Roselli, who they called the General, and that he was a true patriot. So there's a lot of antipathy in the CIA towards Robert Kennedy. And remember that Allen Dulles had been fired after the Bay of Pigs, and that created a certain amount of resentment. With regard to the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover's job was being jeopardized by Robert Kennedy, who wanted him out as the FBI director. So J. Edgar Hoover was not supporting of Robert Kennedy. And if a scandal occurred with Marilyn Monroe and she was suicided right at the time that Bobby Kennedy had been there just a few hours earlier, this would then result in Bobby Kennedy's demise as Attorney General. So, and of course the Mafia had their reasons for doing away with Marilyn Monroe to embarrass Robert Kennedy, because Sam Giancana was #1 on Robert Kennedy's War on Crime hit list. So you had coming together of three different groups, very powerful groups, all lacking support for Robert Kennedy. And I call this the Marilyn Monroe template. What I mean by that, this is a template for assassination where the Mafia has boots on the ground and carries out the deeds for the domestic assassinations, while the FBI and the CIA act to provide cover. In other words, the CIA may provide the equipment, in this case the suppository that was originally designed to be used against Fidel Castro, with a very high level of nembutal and chloral hydrate that would cause death and make it appear like a suicide in the case of Marilyn Monroe. And the FBI could cover up the investigation, confiscate records. In the case of the Marilyn Monroe autopsy, slides were stolen, specimens were stolen, disappeared, photos of the autopsy disappeared, and this is something that the FBI has the capability of doing. So you had a triumvirate, if you will, a triad of three groups, with Mafia with boots on the ground, and the CIA providing equipment, maybe communication, and then the FBI covering up the investigation. Putting pressure on the pathologist to conclude that this was a suicide. In fact, Dr. Noguchi hedged and said it was a probable suicide because he himself had reservations about calling this a suicide. So pressure can be put on the pathologist by the FBI, and of course then you have the news media that steps in and supports the FBI in their findings. So you have a coming together of forces with the Marilyn Monroe template. And what this does for the Mafia is it provides insurance to them that when they carry out a hit or an assassination and things don't go quite right, that the FBI can step in and help cover things up. And this also, of course, happened with the John Kennedy assassination, where the Mafia had boots on the ground. The assassination didn't go well, but the pathologists were pressured, as Cyril Wecht has pointed out, to move the wound in the back of the head from the right lower head to the top of the head and change the size of the wound from a baseball to a marble. And again, pressure put on the pathologists to come up with a lone gunman explanation in the case of John Kennedy. In the case of Robert Kennedy, you had the same template, the same Marilyn Monroe template, where the Mafia had boots on the ground. Sirhan Sirhan ostensibly shot Robert Kennedy, but in fact there was a man named Caesar who was a security guard. And remember earlier I mentioned Robert Mayhew was a man that William Harvey contacted, formed the CIA Mafia hit team with the mob. Well, it turns out that Robert Mayhew created a detective agency called the Ace Detective Agency. There was only one person who was a member of it, and it was a man named Caesar. And Caesar was the security guard at the Ambassador Hotel who stood directly behind Kennedy, had a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber as Sirhan Sirhan, admitted that he fired his pistol. And as Cyril Wecht has determined, the fatal shot to John Kennedy, due to powder burns at the right temple, had to be no more than 1 inch away from Robert Kennedy's temple when the gun was fired, and yet Sirhan Sirhan never got closer than several feet away because Roosevelt Greer, the bodyguard, was keeping him away. So you have a template for assassination where the Mafia has boots on the ground, and they're backed up by the FBI, and in other cases the CIA, to cover the backside, if you will, of what the Mafia is doing in case the assassination doesn't go exactly as planned. One interesting side note is that there's a Lieutenant Daniel Marvin who graduated from assassin school training and was scheduled to be shipped off to Asia. And he gave an internet interview and said that he was asked to assassinate a man named William Pitzer, who was giving away state secrets. And he said, well, wait a second, this is a citizen of the United States. He says, I'm a trained assassin. I work overseas. He said, the Mafia should be taking care of something like that. And years later, he did a little research on William Pitzer, actually contacted his wife. He found out that William Pitzer had taken pictures in the John Kennedy assassination, pictures that showed a large hole in the back of the head that referred to earlier, which was later changed by the pathologist to a small marble-sized hole. And Lieutenant Colonel Marvin talked to Mrs. Pitzer and said, well, yes, she said, the official story is my husband committed suicide. He had a gunshot wound to the right temple. The only problem, Mrs. Pitzer said, is that her husband was left-handed. So the gist of this analysis is that the CIA assassin or trained military assassin said, well, we don't kill citizens. That's something the Mafia does. We work overseas on these assassinations. So I thought that was an interesting point. The other thing to say is that Dwight Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex, and he talked about a small group of people that tried to intervene in a democracy. Now, they're acting sometimes for the greater good. The people felt that John Kennedy, for example, was weak on communism in Cuba, weak on communism in East Berlin, allowing the Berlin Wall to be built, and weak on the upcoming war in Vietnam, where John Kennedy was not a big proponent of. So, acting on behalf of the greater good, these assassinations occurred because a certain elite group of people felt that the country, the democracy, was making the wrong choices. They had chosen the wrong leaders, and that every once in a while it was necessary for a coup to occur, if you will, and the correct leaders installed. So these men were not acting out of malice, but they acted out of what they thought was the greater good and where the country should be going. Have you ever tried to solve a puzzle and you've got all the pieces put together, and then there's one piece that's missing that you can't find. I mean, Robert Kennedy had 4 major opponents. We've talked about 3 of them. We've talked about Sam Giancana, who was in lockstep surveillance under Robert Kennedy's war on crime. We've talked about William Harvey, who, in an interview with his wife, stated that both she and William Harvey of the CIA absolutely detested Robert Kennedy. And we've talked about J. Edgar Hoover, who had a mutual contempt with Robert Kennedy, who was trying to fire him as FBI director, a position which J. Edgar Hoover held very dearly. But there's a 4th person who outranks all the others, who Robert Kennedy did not see eye to eye with, to say the least. His name was LBJ. Robert Kennedy and his lawyers were submitting affidavits and documents to the Senate Ethics Committee regarding LBJ and the TFX scandal, the Bobby Baker scandal, and a certain individual named Mac Wallace, who some felt to be a hired assassin and friend of LBJ. And the question arises, did LBJ know about what was going to happen? J. Edgar Hoover was next door neighbor to LBJ. He would come over on birthday parties for LBJ's daughter and bring presents. They had a close friendship that extended through the years. The question arises, and there's no way to prove it, would J. Edgar Hoover ever walked across the street on the morning that Marilyn died and knocked on the door and said, "There's a big event going to happen, LBJ, that I think you need to know about. It could have a big impact on your career." And LBJ would say, "Oh, what would that be, J. Edgar?" He said, "Well," he says, "Marilyn Monroe is going to be suicided tonight." And LBJ would say, "Well, what's the purpose? What's going on?" He said, "Well, it just seems that Bobby Kennedy is visiting there about 4 hours before Marilyn decides to commit suicide." And LBJ says, "So you're talking about a honey trap." Now, honey trap is when a beautiful starlet, you've seen them in the James Bond movies, becomes romantic with a famous political leader that could result in that leader's demise. About a year before Marilyn died, there was a scandal in England called the Profumo scandal. And John Profumo was the British Secretary of War. And he met a young lady named Christine Keeler at Lady Astor's mansion, who was swimming in Lady Astor's swimming pool. And John Profumo became attracted to her and had an affair with her. The interesting thing was that Christine Keeler had a boyfriend who was a Russian spy, even had a Minox camera, kind of like Lee Harvey Oswald had, that's used for taking photographs confidentially. And Ivanov had taken pictures, it's now been determined, of the X-15 project that were on Profumo's desk, and also plans for defending Berlin, which in 1961 was a big deal. John Profumo eventually had to admit his affair with Christine Keeler and resign, and shortly thereafter, a year or so after that, Premier Macmillan resigned, in part due to the Profumo scandal. So LBJ, would suddenly realize that if Bobby Kennedy was caught in a honey trap, that it could put a serious dent in his criticism and attacks on LBJ, and could even force Robert Kennedy to resign as Attorney General. In addition, it could even have an impact on John Kennedy, because John Kennedy had a little relationship with Marilyn as well. Depending on how far the press decided to cover these issues, it could perhaps keep John Kennedy off the ticket in 1964. These are all possibilities. You can't prove what would be the ramifications. But this would be something that would be certainly beneficial to LBJ. And why would Hoover, though, even mention this to LBJ? Why not just let it happen? And typically J. Edgar liked to have insurance. In other words, when he was involved in something clandestine, he always liked to have somebody above him who was aware of it that could give him backside protection, if you will, insurance. That if something were to go wrong, that J. Edgar Hoover would be protected by a higher up. At any rate, I think this is a possibility. And with the FBI involved, in the case of Marilyn Monroe, you have compromise of the autopsy, compromise of the slides, which disappeared, compromise of the tissue specimens of the autopsy that disappeared. And there are certain overtones with the John Kennedy assassination. I mentioned the Marilyn Monroe template. And with the John Kennedy assassination, you had the Mafia with boots on the ground shooting. You had the CIA providing some of the equipment. The Mafia didn't use suppositories in those days, but the CIA did, and contracted with a university chemist to make this suppository to make it look like a suicide. And pressure would be applied on the news media similarly to report that everything pointed, in the case of Marilyn Monroe, to suicide, and in the case of John Kennedy, to a lone gunman. It's interesting that LBJ was seen ducking just before the assassination shots were fired, and he said that he was leaning over on the speaker in front of him to listen to what the Secret Service was saying. Others viewed it as him ducking because he was afraid he might get shot. LBJ had told his mistress, Madeline Brown, the night before the assassination that after tomorrow he wouldn't have the Kennedys to be a problem with him anymore. And LBJ was very angry at John Connally getting into the jump seat of that presidential limousine. He wanted Senator Yarborough to be in there, who was a supporter, by the way, of Robert Kennedy. And literally, LBJ was yelling at John Connally to get out of that jump seat, but Connally refused. So what I'm sketching here is a template for assassination that involves the FBI and the CIA and the Mafia and a person higher up, such as the Vice President, who could back up these other institutions, who could put pressure on the news media and put pressure on the pathologists to come up with the correct conclusion. And subsequently, you had the murder of Robert Kennedy, perhaps also Martin Luther King, with this similar type of machine, if you will, assassination machine, that was set up during a time in our country's history, in the 60s, of tremendous social upheaval and turmoil, where the elites in the power structure felt that the country was moving in the wrong direction. And really, the Marilyn Monroe murder could have succeeded in removing Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General and getting him caught in this honey trap. The only mix-up that occurred was that Eunice Murray stayed that night at the request of Bobby Kennedy, because Marilyn had gotten so upset when Bobby Kennedy confronted her about having a tape of their lovemaking that she became finally hysterical after a fight had ensued. And Bobby Kennedy said to Dr. Greenson, "Why don't you have Eunice Murray spend the night?" And that decision totally changed the outcome of the Marilyn Monroe murder, because what it did is it allowed Bobby Kennedy knowledge from Eunice Murray when they came back at 10:30 that night, as I mentioned earlier in the video, that Bobby Kennedy knew the Mafia was involved, and he knew that the people in the truck, in the FBI truck, didn't come over to help. They could have come over to help, which would suggest to him that perhaps the FBI was standing off, which means that J. Edgar Hoover had foreknowledge. So Bobby Kennedy or Peter Lawford calls J. Edgar Hoover that night and said, look, I know the Mafia did this to Marilyn. This could be very embarrassing to me. We can't do anything about Marilyn. She's gone. But I want you to protect me on this. And J. Edgar Hoover would say, well, Bobby, I can cover this up for you, but I want you to announce tomorrow that I will remain as FBI director in my valiant fight against the communists. And Bobby Kennedy that next morning makes an announcement that J. Edgar Hoover will remain as FBI director for his valiant fight against the communists. So a deal was struck between Hoover and Robert Kennedy because J. Edgar wanted to keep his job and he wanted insurance that he would get to keep his job. And again, if it wasn't for Eunice Murray calling Peter Lawford and Robert Kennedy that night and telling them that Marilyn had been killed by these mobsters, that the whole trap would have worked and Bobby Kennedy might have been forced to resign. If Marilyn was discovered that next morning when a neighbor or somebody knocked on the door and nobody answered and police finally were called and entered and found Marilyn dead, it would be an awkward time to try to compromise phone records, compromise an autopsy, compromise the news media. Would be much more difficult to do had Eunice Murray not been there that night and called Peter Lawford. Finally, let me say that the solution to who killed Marilyn Monroe, was it a suicide, was she suicided, depends on which witnesses that you choose to believe or disbelieve. I know from my own extended Greek family that Frank Schweiss was involved with several other Mafia members in killing Marilyn Monroe. This is something that the extended family has known, and really they kept this quiet for quite a while because Frank Schweiss was still alive and was known to be a killer. So these are, again, who you believe influences the conclusions that you come up to. I've given you my opinion as to what my solution is for the Marilyn Monroe suicide. Let me conclude with a poem that I wrote about Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe would be the pawn of a tryst with Kennedy that went wrong. Marilyn was killed by the mob that night in hopes that Kennedy would feel the bite. "'Tis a probable suicide," said Noguchi. Notice he said probable. But he knew that this could never be, for Marilyn's stomach contained no drugs. 'Tis true that Marilyn was killed by thugs. Marilyn became a pawn, you see, in this Mafia-Kennedy rivalry. An innocent lamb, Marilyn's murder foretold of greater tragedies yet to unfold. The men who committed this treachery would 1 year later in Dallas be, and the failure to solve Marilyn's crime would put John Kennedy next in line. Thank you.